using a batch job to synchronize data. So in this use case, as we use batch in a little bit more of an advanced manner, we're going to be looking at checking for duplicates. When synchronizing data between data sources, you might want to check if a record already exists in the target resource. If you simply add an endpoint to a query, then the target resource is going to effectively overwrite your payload, meaning if I go out and make another call to Salesforce and it responds with a 1 or a 0, that 1 or 0 is going to overwrite what my existing payload is. Now these types of cases, beyond just batch, where you actually need to go out and just add some additional metadata or enrich a message, if you will, with some extra data rather than overwriting the payload, when that use case is needed, this is a great time to use the enricher pattern. Enricher will allow you to make an external call that will act as an enrichment to the message rather than replacing the original payload. To use a message enricher, you can add that scope to the flow, and then you can add message processors into the enricher scope. You can specify the message enricher's source and target, which basically means what data should I grab from the target system and where should I put it, which would be the target itself. So to try to reiterate that, source would be what data should I grab from the new backend I'm calling, let's say, and target being where should I store that on the existing message. Here's a diagram of how the enricher is going to work. First off, the enricher is going to make a copy of the message. So this copy you can see with the two messages with the yellow block, you consider those the payloads, are copies. The copied message is going to go and do whatever work, whether it's calling an external system or doing some additional processing, and then that copy of the message will come out as a message with potentially completely different data on it. So it no longer has access to, say, the yellow block. Now, the enrichment portion happens when the original message, we choose the source. So let's say that the green block here is the source, and then we choose a target on the original message. So step 5 could be us taking the payload that resulted in the source here of that enrichment and setting the target to some flow variable so that the original payload can remain as is and the green block can be moved up as the target here in a flow variable. And then as the message goes down to all the subsequent processors, as you see in step 6, you have your original payload untouched and then the enrichment of the green block. Notice as well, since we can specify a source, we were actually able to ignore the blue block altogether, which in enrichment use cases, you might not need all the data coming out of that target system. Now, adding logic to only insert new records. Another thing we might need to do is once we determine if a record exists in the target resource, we may need to store the result in a record variable. Now this is especially helpful because once we store it in a record variable, that subsequent step is going to be able to filter, as I'll show you in a moment, whether the record exists to determine if that step should trigger at all. So this is where batch step filters come in. If you can imagine batch step 1 where we check for the record, and batch step 2 where we can actually filter. So in batch step 2 we can say only accept via the accept expression records that do not have the variable record_var.exists, or at least record_vars.exist either evaluates to true or false or null rather. So if it does not exist, then come into here and upload to Salesforce. This is what accept expression will allow us to do. Now another area that can be really helpful when you get into batch jobs is the ability to specify whether you should accept all records, only records that have been completely successful or not had a failure, or failures only. Now what this commonly will allow you to do, since records are going to be able to continue processing even if an exception is thrown, is it'll allow you to create steps where you could handle only records that have failed previous steps. You can also have steps that are going to allow records to come in even if they had failed. So say you had kind of an optional step where failures are somewhat expected, subsequent steps could still receive those failed ones. And if you have a batch step, let's say like batch step 2, where it absolutely has to have only successful records from previous steps, you can set the accept policy to no failures, ensuring that you only get records that worked perfectly in previous steps. So let's get into one of our final walkthroughs here, walkthrough 12.3, where we will attempt to restrict processing using a message enricher and batch step filter. And this is where we'll try to bring it all together. We'll create a batch job that pulls a database for records with a specific postal code. We'll use a message enricher to check if a record exists already in Salesforce. We'll add a second batch step and use a filter that only allows new records to be added to Salesforce. And then finally, we'll use a batch commit scope, which we'll talk more about, that will allow us to send multiple records up to Salesforce at once, rather than having to do n number of commits to Salesforce based on how many records we have. Let's get started. Back in Anypoint Studio, we'll make sure that we are in Accounts XML. We're going to bring in another batch processor here at the very top to begin our next use case. We'll rename this processor Pull Database Batch. Now in this case, we are going to copy the pull scope and database connector from our original pull database flow down here. So we'll go in and select those two, go to copy, and then paste them into the input phase that you see here. If it did some weird duplication, feel free to close out of that, and we'll just rename these again to make them a bit more clear. So we will call this pull, and we'll rename this as well to be just database. All right, now that we've got this in place, we still should be selecting records based on the criteria that we had set up in our earlier module. Let's now add a logger component in the batch step of the record phase here. So we'll put a logger into batch step 2. And inside of this logger, let's set it up so it's a bit easy to read. We're going to put in a string literal with 2 line breaks where we say record : space. And then we're just going to add the payload in so we can very easily log each record that comes in and make sure that we're getting that data effectively. So just a quick test before we go any further. Let's go ahead and save up the application and run this project. My hope is once it starts, we are going to see every single one of those accounts based on your zip code show up in the logger. That way we can at least baseline ourselves and make sure that the batch is working successfully. So once it starts up, we should be able to look inside of here, and we can see for each time that it kicks off, I'll lock my logger here so it's a bit easier to read. I can see total records processed 2 in my case, and for each of these I can see the record specifier and the record it picked up. So at least for the starting baseline, I do know that batch is picking up these records successfully. Now, let's see if we can bring Salesforce into the picture. We'll stop the job so far, and inside of our palette, let's go ahead and bring a Salesforce processor in. And in this case, I want to drop it to the left of batch step 2. You'll notice that there's a difference between dropping it into step 2 and to the left of step 2. If we drop it to the left of step 2, it will create a brand new batch step, which is exactly what I want. Double click on the Salesforce endpoint, make sure it's using our connector configuration for Salesforce Basic Auth. And for our operation here, let's go ahead and put in query. Now this is going to be that case where we check for duplicates. So let's use our query builder here. And inside of query builder, we're going to be checking for the existence of account. In this case, we only are checking for a duplicate, so I don't need a lot of fields. I'm just going to be looking for the name specifically. And let's add a filter inside of here. So what I basically want to set up is I want to say, Salesforce, if the name of the record equals the existing payload name, that for me is going to qualify as a duplicate. So if this query where name equals my current record's name comes back as a record in Salesforce, that will tell me that I've got a duplicate on my hands. So I'm going to hit OK here. It'll put my query in place just as I want it. And now I'm going to be setting this up so that I can effectively enrich based on this value. Because again, if Salesforce comes back with an existing record, I don't want it to overwrite my existing payload that's moving through the batch step. To do this, let's search for an enricher inside of here. And we can bring this enricher into the Salesforce component. Now another way that you can do this is you could actually right-click on Salesforce and go to Wrap-In and choose Message Enricher as well. So you could either drag a Message Enricher in and then drag Salesforce in, or just right-click on Salesforce and choose Message Enricher, which will put it in a nice enricher here. I'm also going to right-click and rename this, so I say check for duplicate, make sure my spelling's right, duplicate in Salesforce. All right, so our query is in Salesforce. This is inside of batch step 3. And I'm going to double click on the message enricher where we can set up our source and target. Now our source in this case is going to be the expression payload.size is greater than 0, And the target is going to be, again, a record var because we need it to persist onto the subsequent step of exists. Now don't get too thrown off by this. This expression is a Boolean expression. It will return true or false. So what enricher is saying here is, I don't even care about what the record was that came back. If what is inside of the enricher, if what this guy returns has a size of greater than 0, this will evaluate as true, and that will store the value true in this variable. If it is 0 or less, it is of course going to be false, in which record.exists will be false, meaning that we can upload or create that record inside of Salesforce. Let's now double click on our second batch step here. And inside of here, let's set up a filter expression. So again, I only want non-duplicate records to show up in this step. So my accept expression is going to be a inverse, so I'll do a bang here, and then call record vars dot exists. So if record vars exists is false, again the bang, if you can think of it, it's kind of like inversing the true statement, then I'm going to allow records inside of this step. All right. So let's go ahead and get started inside of here. If we save this up, add a breakpoint on our enricher inside of here. In fact, before we add that breakpoint in, something that might help us out a bit, let's put a logger right after the enricher. That way we can do a little bit of easier debugging. So we'll put a breakpoint right on this logger here. And let's save it up and let's run our application in debug mode here and see what we can come up with. Okay, and then we'll hit yes. Now that we've started up, we can see that our message has gone over to the logger after doing the query from SFDC. After coming out of SFDC from our enricher, we should be able to go to the record phase and we can see whether it exists. So in my case, I actually have a record with this specific name inside of Salesforce. So the name that I am looking at here is the name test. Now if I step forward again and go to my next record in here, in this case I'm looking at the record for Dale Burgers, step forward. Inside of here I can see that Dale Burgers is false. Now in your case you might have false for all of these depending on what the items were that were picked up. You could even go to Salesforce and add a record in to make one come back as true. So for example, I'll do that for Dale Burger now, and I expect you can do one for one of your records as well. So I'll grab Dale Burgers, and I'll send the whole process through just so it can stop right there. And back inside of our browser, we'll go into our Salesforce account. So we'll head into login.salesforce.com. Once again, log in. And once we're logged in inside of here, we can go to accounts. And we can add in a new account. In this case, I'm going to do Dale Burgers. I'll put in the postal code here just so it stays consistent, but won't concern myself with any of the other details, and hit save. Now, once you've added this account into Salesforce, if you go back to Anypoint Studio for testing purposes and restart in debug mode one more time, when you go over that specific account again that you had chosen, we should now see that it comes back with a flag of true, saying effectively that it already exists inside of Salesforce. And this will be key to the insert that we'll be doing in a moment here as well. So again, I go to the logger. This one is true. Once again, this is my account labeled test, so I sort of expect that from the previous. And now, going back to my second account, which came up as Dale Burgers, step forward, and in this case, I'm now set true, so it's able to pick that up in Salesforce without issue. We'll make sure that our project is terminated, and let's go ahead and set up our Salesforce insert. So we will bring in another Salesforce element, this time before the logger. We'll double click on the Salesforce endpoint, and for the operation itself, let's go ahead and choose account create. So this will be create, and the S object type in this case is going to be account. We'll keep the from expression saying payload, And if we look inside of the metadata tab for the input, you can see that the actual metadata looks like this coming from each database record, but the expected data is slightly different. It has multiple fields inside of here, but also is a different structure ever so slightly, being a list of accounts. So to resolve this, let's go ahead and bring a transform message component before the pull scope to prepare it. Inside of transform message, and after the pull scope rather, we'll have the transform message in place here, and this will allow us to transform before sending into batch. What we'll do here to get the transform message to see the metadata, we can simply copy, this is kind of a little trick, we can copy the Salesforce endpoint that's going to be inserting and paste that into the input phase. Now the transform message will be aware of the input and output. This way we can do our mappings very simply. So if we can bring in our relevant pieces here, you may have to scroll quite a bit. So for city, we'll bring that into billing city, country will go to billing country, street into billing street. The name will go into the name field. State into billing state. Postal code, of course, into billing postal code. And that should be about it. You will see account ID here. Leave that out. Salesforce will auto-generate the account ID for us, so we do not need that in this case. So that is going to generate our structure. Then we can remove this extra Salesforce element we used in here just to get the metadata. Again, just a quick trick to be able to introspect that quickly in DataWeave and do our mapping. Now that we have this in place, we can come back into our project. And one more thing that I would like to do is, rather than sending 100, 1,000 different Salesforce queries in, I'd actually like to batch them up and insert 10 records at a time as they come in. To do this, we can use the batch commit scope. So once again, you can drag batch commit in. You could also right click and wrap it in a batch commit as well. So I'm going to do that here. So now Salesforce is wrapped in batch commit. Also rename it so it's a bit more clear, and we'll say insert new records into SFDC. Okay. With batch commit selected, I'll set my batch commit size to 10, and now it should attempt to do 10 records at a time. Now, again, only records that come into this logger should be ones that went into batch commit, which means only records that make it here are ones that actually were inserted. So I'm going to make this a little bit more verbose, and you're more than welcome to as well, just to make sure it's clear. So I'm going to say record was inserted. Okay, and at the very end, I'll even make it a bit more obnoxious by appending on a couple more breaks so it's easy for me to really see this in the logs for testing purposes. So we'll start off by saving this up, and we'll run all of this in normal mode. This will kind of be the grand finale of our batch job here. Make it a bit bigger so you can see. So hopefully it will pull the database, check for duplicates, and then commit anything that needs to be committed. Inside of the console, I'll double click to make this a bit bigger. And once it pulls, it's going to go through and pull for the message. Total records found were 2 succeeded. But notice that there's no mention of it inserting any of these records. This is because all of these were considered duplicates. None of them made it into the insert phase of the job. So while this is pulling, let's head back to our browser and see if we can set ourselves up to get our new record into Salesforce. So back in the MUA All Accounts application, I'm going to go in and I'm going to put in Wendy Crafts. And Wendy's Crafts will be on a similar street to what I had put before. Again, the key thing here, you can make up new data. Just be sure to put it in as a different address, or specifically, if you even keep the same address, that should be okay, but make sure your postal code is the one you're looking for. Okay, so I'm going to make another account called Wendy Crafts and hit Create Record. And once it tells me it creates, I'm going to shoot right back to Studio and see if I can check out this account being actively created. So it's attempting to create through there. I'm going to watch inside of Studio to see if it does in fact pick this up. I can see all these instances of 0 records. All right, and now I can see that the account was created. If I look up, I can see some of my other loggers had triggered off, Specifically, I can now see that, let me make sure I lock this here. I can now see that Wendy Crafts went into that scope that stated record was inserted. So theoretically, if my batch job is working correctly, we should be able to see this new record we just made populate in Salesforce within that 5-second interval we've got set up in our polling. So let's head back and go back to Salesforce. We will go to our accounts. And inside of accounts here, let's go ahead and see if we can find it. We'll do all accounts with postal code, go through that view. And in this case, if I go to the W's, specifically by account name, so if I shift by account name and go to W, I can now see Wendy Crafts inside of here. So it is in fact picking it up and inserting all of that information about Wendy Crafts based on the API call coming from the batch job. So now we've got a real-time integration in place. We can continue to create records, and those should continue to filter into Salesforce.